1 second.
Tina notification biex nibdew. Okay?
3, 2, 1.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome to today's webinar titled The Final Countdown, Preparing for Pay Transparency Directive Compliance. This session is being organized by the Gozo Business Chamber in collaboration with RSM Malta, Ganado Advocates, and with the support of our corporate partner Bank of Valletta. You are encouraged to submit your questions at any point during the discussion using the Q&A function. We will address them during the dedicated segment towards the end of the webinar. Today's session focuses on a highly relevant and timely subject for all businesses as we approach the June 2026 deadline for compliance with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. We have with us a distinguished panel of experts who will provide practical guidance on the directive's requirements and the steps businesses need to take to ensure compliance. Nonetheless, before we begin, I would now like to invite the President of the Gozo Business Chamber, Mr. Michael Gallia, to deliver the opening address.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, The Final Countdown, Preparing for a Pay Transparency Directive Compliance. On behalf of the Gozo Business Chamber, I would like to thank you for joining us for what is a very timely and important discussion for the business community. I would also like to extend our appreciation to our partners for today's event, RSM Malta and Ganado Advocates, as well as Bank of Valletta for their continued support in making initiatives like this possible. The EU Pay Transparency Directive represents a significant shift in how businesses approach remuneration. It introduces new obligations aimed at strengthening transparency, promoting fairness, and ensuring equal pay for work of equal value. While these principles are not new, the level of scrutiny and the formalization of these requirements mark an important development for all organizations, particularly SMEs, which may need to adapt their structures and internal processes. With the June 26 deadline fast approaching, it is essential that businesses begin taking the necessary steps to understand their obligations and prepare accordingly. This is precisely why today's session is so relevant. Through the expertise of our speakers, you will gain a clearer understanding of both the legal framework and the practical measures required to implement compliant pay structures. Beyond compliance, I believe this directive also presents an opportunity for organizations to strengthen trust, improve transparency, and enhance their overall organizational culture. I encourage you to make the most of this session, engage actively, and take advantage of the opportunity to raise any questions you may have. Thank you once again for joining us, and I wish you all a very informative session.
Thank you, Michael, for your intervention and for setting the context for today's discussion. We will now move to our first presentation by Dr. Lara Pace from Ganado Advocates. Dr. Pace is a senior associate within the firm's employment team. She regularly assists clients on employment law and regulatory matters, including drafting employment contracts and issues relating to termination, dismissals, redundancies, discrimination, and industrial disputes. She also advises on litigation as well as corporate, company, and environmental law. Dr. Patch will provide an overview of the key requirements introduced by the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Dr. Patch, the floor is yours.
So first of all, good morning, everyone, and thanks for attending. I will now share my screen and my presentation. The aim of my session is to give you an overview of what the directive says from a legal point of view. So to give you a very broad overview, because the time is limited, but it should give you a good idea of what the legal implications are and what you should be preparing from now until June. Let me at this point share my presentation. And can you see it? Is this fine?
Yes, okay.
It's okay. Okay, so I'm trying to. Okay, so the directive is essentially tries to establish pay equity between genders. So it is a directive which, on the face of it, seems to be a very straightforward and easy directive. But when you get into the granular and the most difficult detail, you realize that there are a number of elements which employers need to implement ahead of time. Why? Because this may lead to considerable amount or at least a change in the way we do things around pay, the kind of information we give to the employees, and also there could be an increased litigation cases on equal pay for work of equal value. So essentially, the directive tries to establish equal pay for work of equal value between employees who are doing the same thing or work of equal value. So, as such, the directive has two main pillars, I would say. General pay transparency obligations. So, there are a lot of provisions in the directive surrounding pay information, giving employees information around pay. Now, let me give you some background to this because it's important that you understand. Equal pay provisions have been established in the European treaties since almost the inception of the European Union, so since its very start. So, equal pay for work of equal value between men and women is an important pillar of EU law. Notwithstanding this, we have seen that in many member states, the gender pay gap between men and women has remained consistent for many years, and it has been difficult to bridge. We have also seen, and this is the case in Malta, that cases on equal pay are relatively few. So, notwithstanding in Malta, equal pay is a broad application of EU law. So, it's not even a gender claim, but it's broader. Employees, irrespective of their gender, need to be paid the same rate of remuneration for the same work or work of equal value. Claims have been relatively low. And the reason is the Commission found that employees do not have enough information around pay. So essentially, the directive tries to overcome this. It impinges on employer an obligation to give employees a number of information relating to their pay to enable them to make claims if they think that they are being underpaid. So the transparency obligations apply to all employers, irrespective of their size. The larger employers have what we call reporting obligations, which commence from the 7th of June of 2027 and shall be on an annual or every 3 years, depending on the size of your organization. So the reporting is a reporting of gender pay gaps in the remuneration across your organization and in category of workers, which will define and explain what this is. And this reporting to the authorities will be staggered according to the number of employees within your organization. So the directive will come into force or is required to be implemented by member state by the 7th June of 2026. And it is very likely that Malta will meet this deadline. So it is expected that Malta will have draft legislation in place by that date. Now, under the directive, when we speak of equal pay for work of equal value, pay is not just the base salary. So here we need to take into consideration everything which the employee receives or takes home. So the directive defines pay as any elements, whether in cash or in kind, directly or indirectly, which the employee receives. So everything the employee takes home will be considered pay for the purposes of this directive. So this is generally quite straightforward, where you have just basic and variable. But if employees are given a car, not to use as a tool for their job, but as a fringe benefit, as a perk, or if there are insurance policies, health insurance, pension benefits, or any other form of benefits which are not monetary, they need to be calculated, they need to be considered as elements of pay. So here we really need to take into consideration everything which the employee takes home. Let's distinguish between pay, elements of pay, so what the employees take home, and equipment such as a laptop or a car, which is used to actually carry out work. So we need to distinguish between the two elements, but generally, anything, earnings, which the employee will be receiving, need to be considered as elements of pay. So when we are referring to pay under the directive, it's not just the basic and overtime or a performance bonus, but it includes everything. Now, from now until 2026, what are the rights which will be introduced for employees and also candidates which are applying for a job within the organization? So there are a number of rights. They are called transparency rights because they seek to give employees information around their pay. Now, these apply to all employers, irrespective of their size. So if you have a small organization here, obviously the burden to actually organize yourselves could be a bit more onerous than if you are a much larger organization. So applicants, the first rights which applicants, so candidates who are applying for a job, will have a right to know their initial pay, so their starting pay. Pay, taking you back to the previous slides, includes everything the employee takes home, or the salary range, which is the pay range which the employee will be able to receive for that position. And the directive gives examples how this can be communicated to the applicant. It can be in the job advert. It can be given to the employees prior to the negotiation of the contract. What is important is that this initial pay is given to the employee at a time when they can negotiate their pay. So if there is a screening process before actually so there is a selection process, possibly this initial pay could be given at that point in time. We have to see how Malta will implement this element of the directive, but it is very unlikely that it will require employers to put the initial pay or the salary range in the adverts for the position. And the second duty, which is on employers, is that employers will be prohibited going forward from asking applicants about their history. So here there's a bit of a culture shift in how we conduct recruitment. We cannot, once the directive is implemented, call an individual for an interview and actually ask him, what are you currently receiving in your current job, or what is your pay history, to then build economic proposal around his salary. The idea here is to be able to literally plug in the employee, the candidate, within our salary structure. So if you applied for a role, that is the role, this is the initial salary or its range, and you actually plug in the individual within your salary structure. So it's different from building an economic proposal around the individual, but actually paying for the role which you are advertising for. Employers will need to make accessible the criteria used to determine pay, pay level, and pay progression. So employees will have a right to know what criteria was used to determine their pay, everything they take home. So clients who have started to implement this have set out on their company intranet how the individual's pay, so what were the criteria to determine his pay, and how the employee moves from one pay level to another. So the employee should be in a position to know how they progress within their salary structure. What criteria do I need to get promotion, to move to the next level? And these need to be made easily accessible. There is an exemption for employers with having 50 or less employees in relation to the pay progression, but we'll see whether Malta will implement this exemption for these employers. And next, employees will have, and this is the most difficult part of the directive, in the sense that employees will have what we call an added access right. They will have a right to request their pay level, which is fine, their intake pay, as well as the average pay. So here is the average take-home pay of men versus females in a category of workers. So what employees can do now, going forward, come June 6th, is they can ask, listen, Mr. Employer, I'm in category X, or I should be in category 3. What is the average of pay, male versus female? And this is this is an important access right, and it is the kind of right which will allow employees to determine, or at least to lay the first steps on whether they have an equal pay claim, in the sense that once you obtain the average, if you are fairly below average, then most probably you will need to look into, the employee will start to ask questions. Why am I being paid less than the average? Now, not all pay claims can, not all pay disparities lead to a claim, in the sense that you could have pay disparities so long as these are justified and so long as there are grounds to justify the pay disparity. But the truth is that once employees will obtain these averages, they will start to ask questions. Now, this is the sort of transparency right which employers cannot hide in a handbook and hope that the employee is not aware of this right. The directive imposes a positive obligation on employers. They are to inform employees on an annual basis of the right to this access request. And certain member states, including Poland, have requested employers to inform employees by 1st of March, because informing them at the end of the year would be a bit pointless. But again, we'll need to see how Malta will implement this provision. What is for sure is that employers will need to remind employees that they have an access request and that they can exercise this right. Once employers receive an access request, they have 2 months to respond. If you have everything in order, and if you have your categorization in order, as Yash will soon explain, it will be quite simple to give this information. But if you haven't done anything, 2 months is a very short time to bring your house in order. And this is why, as a first step towards compliance, we need to ensure that you have salary structures in place which reflect the needs of the directive. As a last one, employers are prohibited from restricting employees from disclosing their pay. So if you look at your policies and your contracts of employment, you cannot have prohibition from employees to talk about their pay. Now, this is the most difficult and this is the right which can start to trigger claims, which is the famous access request right I was speaking about in the previous slide. So come June, once the directive is implemented, employees can go to their manager and request average pay information in their category of workers. Average male, so what are the males in my category receiving versus what are the females in the category receiving. And this should look something like this. So the directive doesn't tell us how we should present this information, and this is something Ganado has created to be able to give you a visual example of what this access request reply should look like. So here we have the average base pay of females versus the average base pay of male, the hourly rate, because the directive wants employees to know what they are receiving exactly per hour, against the variables female and the variable male. Now imagine come June, an employee makes an access request, male or female in Malta, and they realize they are way below average. There, the employee will start to ask questions. So it is important to get the data correct, so the elements of pay in order, and also to determine the category of workers. This is, in fact, the main point of the directive. The directive requires employers to have pay structures in place to ensure equal pay for work of equal value. And you would tell me, don't we all have pay structures in place? Yes, if I had to look at my clients and the clients who've been assisting in the past year or so, most employers do have salary structures in place. The difficulty is, do your salary structure stand an equal pay, an equal value test? So like with like is easy. When two individuals are doing the same work, they need to be paid the same rate of pay. But when two individuals are doing work of equal value, they also should have the opportunity, and this is a question of opportunity, to be paid the same rate of pay. Let me give you an example, because at Ganado we've carried out this exercise internally. When we've carried out the categorization, so when we were categorizing our workforce, we did this about a year ago to understand really what the directive is all about. Our maintenance employees, which were predominantly male, scored the same as our receptionists, who were predominantly female. And you would think receptionists and maintenance are two complete different jobs with two different skills and two different job descriptions. And yet, when we categorized our workforce, when we evaluated our workforce in terms of equal value, they scored to be of the same value. And this is exactly what the directive wants us to do. So it's a question of looking into our salary structures and determining whether roles, not individuals, roles are of equal value. Yash will explain how this is done in more detail, because this is a very technical skill which requires specialized experience. But this is essentially what the directive requires us to do. So the directive requires us to have pay structures based on value. And the directive says what we should assess when looking at value. So we need to look at effort, responsibility, working conditions, and other factors such as and skills, which may include soft skills. So we need to have gender neutral criteria assessing our workforce to determine their value in order to categorize our workforce. Therefore, in order, as a first step from now until June, to enable to, first of all, respond to the access request, to build our salary structures on the basis of equal value, and then to be able to report, we need to split our workforce into categorization. Now, to do so, you would need to carry out an evaluation process. And how is this done? These are gender neutral job evaluations, where the directive tells us to look at the elements I have described before. We need to look at the efforts, responsibility, working conditions, and skills of the role. Job evaluation, as Yash will explain, is a specialist skill and is something which requires a lot of experience. It's also something which requires to determine what the role does in practice. So we need to be able to look at the roles and assess their values. Once, again, Yash will go into more detail on this. Once we've categorized our workforce, we will get what we call global grades or a grading system. And you may be surprised that two rows, which seemingly on paper are different, they actually they are actually valued as equal value. They are valued the same or being of equal value, which means then that they should have the opportunity to be paid the same rate of pay. Now, the directive doesn't really want to flatten the structure. In the sense, what the directive wants is that individuals have the same opportunity if they are doing the same work or work of equal value. That is to say, employers are not precluded from rewarding performance or rewarding experience, but it needs to be done within a framework which takes value into account. Let me just skip this. So once we would have carried out our categorization, we would then look into our workforce. So this is something which should be done between now until June. These different blocks would be the categories within your salary structure, and you will map out all the employees. Now, once you map out all the employees and you've carried out your categorization, you will start to identify where your issues are. So this is a good exercise to carry out once you've done your categorization, to identify where your problems are. So those individuals who are being paid much more than their category, why are they being paid more? You could have a justification. And that justification needs to be gender neutral. For example, when we came to do ours internally, our IT specialists have scored much higher, were being paid much higher than other individuals in their category. And the reason was because IT specialists had a market force, a premium, which attracted a higher salary. So there was a reason to explain why they were being paid higher than their category. In some reasons, it could be historical. In some reason, it could be we have asked an individual his pay history and then adjusted the salary to fit the economic proposal at the time. So not all pay disparities we would be able to justify. It's also something which will take time. And it's also something which you would require a concrete action plan to adjust any disparities which you cannot justify. What is important at this stage, but my advice to you is to look into where the outliers are. So who are those roles and those individuals who are being paid more than their category and the reason why. Now, the reason why you would look into all this and why you need to bring your house in order is because claims on equal pay can have quite a financial burden on the employer. Now, these claims, which I have outlined on this slide, are not local claims. They are claims which happened in the UK. But financially, an employee, as seen, for example, let's take the next case there, the claim was for 30 million. So this is a huge amount of money. But just to give you an example, for example, of the next case there, the shop assistants have next, we all know next, the shop retail, the shop assistants who are working on the shop floor won a claim because they managed to prove that they were of equal value as the employees working in the stores. So you would think stores and shop assistant, different skill set, different job description. When the court assessed the value of the two rows, they were of comparable value. So what you don't want is to be blindsided and have a court carry out the evaluation instead of yourself, and to have obviously be blindsided with these sort of large claims. Now, in Malta, claims are not just male and female claims. They can, as I've said before, an employee, irrespective of his gender, can claim that he is being paid less than a comparator or another employee who is doing the same work or work of equal value. So unlike most of the European Union, in Malta, an equal pay claim is, so to speak, gender neutral, or rather irrespective of gender. So just a quick, so the first session was really on pay transparency and what needs to be done from now until June to comply with the transparency requirements. From June 2027, employers would need to be able to report on the pay gap within their organization. Now, this obligation is on the much larger employers, 100 plus. And the pay reporting, once you have all your elements in place, once you have all your categorization in place, and once you have all your elements in place on what is paid, what is being paid out to employees in your organization, it is quite a straightforward exercise. The elements in red, because for time constraint, I will just give an overview, which is the total gender pay gap across the organization, in complementary and fixed, as well as the portion of male and female in each quartile band. So in each band split into quartiles, these elements would need to be sent to the authority, which is the DIER, and which most probably the DIER will be the receiving authority, and they will publish it and make them available to the public, with also comparisons by sector. The last one, which is the most difficult one and the most important reporting element, is you would need to employers report the gender pay gap, so the difference in pay between men and women, in a category of workers, broken down by ordinary and variable. So once again, we need to look at the different categories, so employees who are doing the same thing or work of equal value. And in each category within your workforce, we would need to give employees and the workers rep the gender pay gap. This is difficult because although you don't need to give it to the authorities, if there is a pay gap in a category of workers of 5% or more, which is generally the case, and from our experience, most companies will have categories with a pay gap of 5% or more, you have 6 months as employer to either rectify that pay gap or justify it, or else the obligation is to enter, this is what a report looks like, to enter into a joint pay assessment. Now, a joint pay assessment, nobody knows exactly what this looks like because it's the first time this has been introduced into EU law, but it's a pay audit with the employee reps to try and to determine what the pay differentiation stems from and to try to close off that gap. So essentially, if there is a 5% or more pay gap in a category of workers, this will entail a further pay audit with the employee rep. So it's essentially exposing all your books and all your numbers to the employee rep. Now, this is what a report looks like. This is of McLaren, for example. It's a real report. And you would see, for example, it's very graphic, very it's very attractive, and this has been actually printed to show and published to show the gender pay gap within McLaren. We may also find, look, other member states which have implemented similar reporting provisions within their jurisdiction. These sort of reports, you can find them online, and you can also compare them by sectors. So you can understand where the pay gap is in the various sectors. Okay, this is the joint pay assessment. So now, as we said, not all pay disparities would lead to a claim. In some cases, employers would be able to justify, but these justifications need to be, first of all, real. And secondly, they need to be proportionate, and they cannot be tainted with gender bias. One of these elements is the fact that, for example, an employee has not received a performance bonus because of pregnancy or career breaks, even though I know that currently the law allows employers to do so, will probably be seen as a justification which is tainted with gender bias. So having employees being paid differently because an employee has gone on maternity or has taken a career break will be difficult to use as a justification going forward. But there are other justifications which can be used. again, they need to be real and they need to be proportionate. When I say proportionate, in the sense that, let me take, for example, experience. At some point, experience can be used to pay X more than Y, but at some point, experience is the experience used to be more efficient on the job plateaus. So at some point, the employees would have to reach pay equity. You cannot justify paying someone more because he has more length of service unless you can prove that that length of service is actually required to carry out the job more efficiently, or that the length of service you are more you have gained more skills to be carrying out that job. So in exercising these justifications, they need to make sense, they need to be actual. Market forces, for example, it would be fine to pay an AI specialist right now more than other employees in his category if we can show that AI specialists are hard to find and the market demands a higher salary. But in a couple of years' time, will this reality still be the case? Can I still say that I need to pay AI specialists more? So while differentiation in pay can be justified, we need to make sure that the justification is robust. Because going forward, and I haven't included in this presentation, but just by way of background, employees will also have a number of rights when it comes to judicial action. So they will be able to recover. There is no minimum on the reparation. They are entitled to full reparation on equal pay claims. They will have better access to the justice system, and the courts can order employers to present all their books and all documents in the case which were not made available to the employee. So it isn't just at this stage where employees would have a number of obligations, but also when it comes to the litigation, they have a number of protections which will enable them to build quite a strong case. So this is all I have for this morning. It's very hard to compress such a complex topic in 20 minutes, but if you do have questions or if you do have follow-ups, feel free to reach out. I will address any questions you will have this morning also. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Patch, for that comprehensive and insightful overview. And we now move to the second part of today's session. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Yashar Klip from RSM Malta. Yashar is a people and organizational consultant and an organizational psychologist. He specializes in HR, organizational design, development, and transformation, bringing a strategic approach to people advisory. His work focuses on aligning organizational structures and culture with strategic objectives, spanning human performance, technological enablement, and process efficiency. Mr. Klip will guide us through how organizations can design and implement compliant pay structures. Mr. Klip, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Michael, as well, for setting the scene, and thank you, Laura, for kicking us off with a very robust overview of the directive, which hopefully makes my life a little bit easier now. Thank you also for our attendees for your time and attention. So I'm going to have to try run through this relatively quickly. This is going to be a slightly more technical and detail-oriented part of this webinar, and it's going to focus on creating compliant pay structures, which really is the foundation of becoming compliant with this directive, as Laura has already mentioned. So on a very fundamental level, the directive has two primary objectives. The one is to eliminate unjustified gender wage gaps. And as Laura has mentioned, this has been a difficult challenge to put a dent into. It's proved to be a sticky problem. But the way in which this directive is going to be enforced, I think, will likely be relatively effective in the coming years. And this is definitely a core part of the spirit of this directive, right? The kind of the social justice of historical gender wage gaps. But it's the second objective which I want to focus on in my presentation today, which is mandating equal pay for equal work or work of equal value. As Laura has mentioned, equal work would be the work two individuals performing the same role within a business do, and work of equal value could be far beyond that. In other words, people who are operationally or functionally in very different parts of the business. However, through an exercise, which I'm about to walk you through, it has been found that their role yields equal value to the business. And in many ways, once you solve for objective 2, solving for objective 1 becomes easier. It at least becomes very clear where gender wage gaps exist and why they exist. So as I say, the backbone of the kind of compliance journey here is having a compliant pay structure. And this is something that I think a lot of businesses are going to need to have to do some work on. I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves if your existing pay structure is already compliant. Now, it's obviously impossible for me to know for sure, but I'm going to give you a few questions to ask yourself and a few pointers which might kind of give you some prior indication of whether or not that is likely to be the case. So first of all, there need to be clear grades or categories of jobs, okay? If there are not this kind of clustering of roles or jobs into these grades or categories, there is no basis with which you can say that you can compare the value of one role to another. However, how this clustering of jobs occurs is very important. So was this done using clearly defined criteria which were consistently applied to each and every unique job within the business? And do these cover the fundamentals laid out in the directive of skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions? Now, when it comes to historical pay structures, I think the truth is that they were certainly not designed with these kinds of criteria in mind. It's very unlikely or very uncommon that that's the case. It can be true that existing pay structures may be a fairly close approximation or reflection of what a pay structure might need to look like. It might be accidentally the case. But what we find is that there's a certain level of, shall we say, common sense, which is, from a legal perspective, not sufficiently rigorous in actually making this case. So, for example, a lot of classification systems would be based on hierarchy or on functional divisions. And while it might be logical to think that, for example, a manager class is more valuable than a supervisor class, which is more valuable than a professional class, and then an administrative class, that's actually pretty difficult to prove in a tribunal setting. So unless the criteria cover these 4 compensable factors, and unless you can quite easily make the argument to someone who, in exercising their rights, asks why their role exists in category 3 and not category 4 or 5, for example, you're going to have a difficult time defending your pay structure. Even when there are, as I say, let's say relatively robust classification systems, which are probably a pretty close approximation of what actual value is, it's still necessary to ensure that the application of these criteria occurs through some kind of a process or tool which is sufficiently analytical, rigorous, objective, and gender neutral, right? And that gender neutrality is important because gender discrimination can obviously occur in overt, direct ways, for example, due to discrimination or prejudice. However, it can also be subtly baked into a system itself. So, for example, a pay structure that places a lot of emphasis on the physical effort required to do a job without giving any real consideration to something like the emotional effort or the psychological effort. might be in trouble. Why? Because it would overvalue traditionally male-dominated roles and underemphasize the value that traditionally female-dominated roles would add. It also needs to be obviously reliable. In other words, if you repeat the experiment, so to speak, across time, that the results need to be similar. In other words, it's not just due to chance or to kind of temporary factors, and it's actually appraising value in a robust way. Now, in many cases, existing pay structures are something which need quite a lot of work, and for many businesses, they may not even have them, right? So what I'm about to walk you through is really the typical journey that we undergo with our clients, which is the creation of a pay structure, which is built for directive compliance, but also built to be applicable, appropriate, accurate, relevant to the business. Because in creating a new pay structure, you are obviously creating the parameters within which you incentivize people. You are communicating to your employees, to the business at large, what we value around here, what we stand for. So I think it's important that however we define value, because of course we need to first define value before we can ascertain what the value of individuals' roles are and how they compare to one another. That needs to be done in a way that reflects the organizational reality. So it needs to reflect, for example, the way you bring value to your stakeholders, to your customers, the operational reality, the strategy or the vision. Where are you going as a business? What is it that you need to do to survive and thrive in the short to medium and even long term? What kind of culture are you trying to create? What are the values you espouse and claim to stand by? These kinds of things should not be at odds with the pay structure you create, right? From a compliance perspective, it's obviously important that this needs to be objective. And when I say objective, objectivity is largely achieved through rigor, through really having a detailed tool that cuts subjectivity out of the equation to the greatest extent possible. Because obviously bias exists on an unconscious level and it can creep into these processes in all kinds of ways. As I've already explained, it also needs to be gender neutral by design. Now, the outcome of defining value should actually be a tool which is used then to evaluate all jobs within the business. And so what we typically do with our clients, we've done it internally as well, is we convene a central job evaluation committee, right? A standard group of individuals who are responsibilized with evaluating all roles in that particular business. And we facilitate and walk through that process. Now, these people obviously need to be trained. They need to receive the kind of information you're getting today, the kind of stuff Laura has provided, an overview of really what the directive is about, not just what the clauses and requirements are, but the reason that they exist, so people actually start to understand that, as well as some guidance on how to mitigate bias and how to use the tool that they're about to use and how to use it properly within the process that we guide them through. So a process owner is obviously important to have in this process. Usually this is going to be HR. So in other words, from June 7 and henceforth, there are going to be certain responsibilities in the business to govern pay transparency issues. People may approach their managers may, for example, hand these requests over to HR. It's up to businesses to figure out exactly how to do it, but having that process owner involved is important. Senior leadership is also important to have in this process. And in fact, in step one, we work closely with senior leadership within the business who are best positioned to understand where the business is going and what value actually means to the business. So we're balancing compliance and business outcomes, right? Business success. And then collectively speaking, the members of this job evaluation committee should have quite exhaustive knowledge of the various roles within the business and the nuances of these roles. They then individually evaluate these roles using role profiles, which obviously need to be up to date, And this is quite a mechanistic process, as you'll see in the rest of my presentation. And as Laura has also mentioned, the trick here is to evaluate jobs and not people. And I can say through a lot of experience that it is very difficult not only to get people to think in this way, but even for myself, who understands this quite well. It's something the brain naturally comes back to, especially in roles where perhaps there is only one incumbent. It's obviously important also to capture outcomes. Creating an audit trail throughout this entire process is going to be necessary where, for example, perhaps 5 years from now, there's an equal pay claim made against the business, and perhaps the people who actually set the system up are no longer there, right? So the more paperwork, the more documentation, the more things are rationalized, the easier it's going to be to navigate those conversations. Now, with all jobs evaluated, and what I'm about to show you in the upcoming slides is the point factor job evaluation methodology. There are several approaches to job evaluations. I'm not going to tell you about the ones I do not recommend. This is far and away the superior. It's the most kind of granular, rigorous, objective, and scientific. And the outcome of this process is going to be that each role is going to have a score associated with it. Now, taking all roles within the business, you basically take payroll data, which, as Laura has mentioned, is broader perhaps than the kind of automated reports you'll get from your payroll system, as well as the outcomes of the evaluation process. And you need to cluster these roles according to their value. And at this point, you have a new pay structure. Now, once this new pay structure has been created, there may be outliers, there may be individual discrepancies or wage outliers. There may also be gender wage gaps that exist across the business as a whole or within the various categories of value that you have created. Now, it's going to be pretty clear where these exist once you've undergone this process. You're then going to need to investigate why they exist. In other words, are there justifiable reasons? Are they objective? Are they gender neutral, as Laura has mentioned? Or are they in fact not? In which case, you are going to need to remediate those in some way. And this is obviously, again, going to need to occur within some kind of clear governance structure, some codified, uniform strategy or approach, which you use to, on an individual case-by-case basis, understand why these outliers and gender wage gaps exist and to respond accordingly. Now, before this process even begins, and I'm not sure where each of the currently 78 participants are in your compliance journeys. Some of you may be hearing about this for the first time. Some of you may be fairly far along on your journey. But there are some initial preparations that you need to make now if you have not already done this. The first is to start onboarding and training key stakeholders, right? This is obviously quite a paradigm shift. This is quite a change. Ideally, this is something that is managed in quite a structured, strategic sort of way, how you communicate this. Obviously, it's called Pay Transparency for a reason. Transparency really is one of the core principles here. And getting senior leadership on board and sponsoring it from a top-down level is very important. Workers' representatives, if you have them, also need to then agree with the criteria laid out in that definition of value in step 1 to avoid potential challenges down the line. And again, these need to be informed. People need to be trained and they need to understand what this is all about. The bigger picture as well as the minutiae, their role within this process and how it's going to play out for the foreseeable future. Updating job descriptions or role profiles, again, very, very important. These create a common frame of reference between the evaluation committee members. And so having accurate, up-to-date job descriptions or role profiles, which are also sufficiently detailed and descriptive, is really going to enable accuracy in the process. And this is also why it's important to have that mix of people within an evaluation committee, such that if there are some major issues in the role profiles, there's always going to be at least one person who can put their hand up and say, hang on, we have a problem here. And they can advocate as to why. Payroll data is also something that needs to be prepared, and this can be quite a time-consuming exercise. As Laura has gone into quite a lot of detail on, we're not just talking base salary, we're talking benefits, we're talking allowances, we're talking overtime, shift pay, etc. It's going to take a bit of time to gather all of this data to understand what the total package to each employee is going to be. So for those of you who have not started, this is where you begin. In parallel, potentially, or at least once this is done, you actually then need to define value. And this is about creating a framework. Now, the directive mandates that skills, effort, responsibility, and working conditions at minimum are considered. They actually also mention interpersonal skills as something which should not be downplayed, something often which is more relevant or highlighted in female-dominated professions. But these 4 factors are the floor. You need to consider all of those, and your pay structures need to be built around those. Now, you can add additional factors, right? And that depends on what is relevant in the business. And I think it's important to say here that this should be a holistic model. In other words, each and every individual within your business, given the role in which they work, should be able to look at these criteria and say, I see at least something in there that acknowledges the kind of value that my role brings to the business. Now, the directive mandates these 4 compensable factors, as they are called. It does not explain or define them. And so what is typically required, and this is certainly what we do with our clients, is we break those down, we unpack those. Skills, for example, is a very broad construct. What does skills mean? It could mean technical skills, as I said, it could mean interpersonal skills, it could mean knowledge, it could mean something else, and so on and so forth for effort, responsibility, and working conditions as well. Very important at this stage to clearly define these, to ensure that, and to codify this, to create a tool that brings everyone around the table with a common frame of reference, that when we talk about skills or we talk about knowledge in this business, this is exactly what we mean. And that the tool used to then measure knowledge in this business is built in an appropriate manner. Now, this collection of sub-factors needs to be holistic. As I've said, it needs to be gender neutral by design as well, but they are not going to be created equal. So the kinds of value that, for example, physical effort adds to a business like RSM Malta is going to be quite different from the kind of value that impact on business results or leadership responsibility might have on the business, and that kind of ecosystem-wide impact. So this is where weighting comes into the play, right? And so you're going to weight each of these factors. The weightings are going to add up to 100%, and it's going to essentially ensure that the most valuable things are given the precedence that they deserve. So at this point, you have defined value. That is step 1 out of the way, and that should exist within a tool. Now, you then use this tool to evaluate roles, and I'll give you an example of this. In a hospital environment, you'll have a collection of jobs or roles, everything from a cleaner to CEO, a number of roles in between. Let's assume this hospital environment in which we all work for the next 10 minutes has updated role profiles and job descriptions, and we are now members of the committee evaluating these roles. We start with the role of a cleaner, and we have our framework. We have defined value as is relevant and obviously also in a compliant manner vis-a-vis this hospital environment. And so if using, for example, the RSM tool, we rate each of these sub-factors relative to the role on a 5-point scale. So in other words, as a committee member, your experience would be you have this tool in front of you. It is very detailed in terms of the descriptions it's giving, and the descriptions and definitions, not just for the sub-factors themselves, but what is a 2 knowledge? What is a 3 in knowledge? What is a 4 in knowledge? What is the difference between those, such that people can more accurately peg the reality of that role to that scale? And essentially at this point, job by job, sub-factor by sub-factor, on an individual basis, the committee members are going to assign scores, in this case, between 1 and 5, to the sub-factors for this role. And that needs to be done for all roles within the business. Now, phase 3 is then actually creating the final pay structure. So you've now essentially assessed the value of a role and of all roles. You now need to create categories and classes of job or of role which reflect that and cluster roles accordingly. Now, you may, for example, in this case, and this is fictitious data, by the way, you may have 7 different categories. Now, it's important that these categories span the minimum possible score that a job can get and the maximum possible score, and that these job categories are non-overlapping. So you will see that the upper limit for band 1, for example, is not the same as the lower limit for band 2. Jobs are going to fall into one and only one of these categories, and each of those are going to have a salary band associated with it. As you may notice, when it comes to those salary bands, there may be some overlap there. And as I'll explain later, there is some freedom within the framework here. But once you've created this, and you may, for example, choose to go with 7 categories or 12 or 17, that's going to depend again on what makes sense for the business. So there's a broader kind of HR and business picture to keep in mind here. How big are we as a business? How vertical is our structure? How are we trying to create career progression systems in the business such that people understand that there is ways to move up and to grow within this business? These are all kinds of things you're going to need to consider, but it is ultimately a freedom. Now, with a cleaner's job being evaluated, they are going to simply fit into one and only one of these categories. In this case, again, fictitious data, but category 1. An IT manager would fit into one and only one of these categories, as would the role of a surgeon. And in this case, we might see that these 2 roles both fit into category 5. And so this then becomes an example of roles of equal value. Very different kind of work that's being done on a day-to-day basis, different kinds of knowledge or skills required, different levels of responsibility, different working conditions. However, when you balance everything out according to the weightings, they are deemed to be roughly of equal value. And so they would need to be paid between this, again, fictitious pay band, in this case of 45 and 70,000 euro per annum. And if they are outliers, those outliers would need to be objectively justified. And this would be done for all other roles within the business. And this is how you essentially create a compliant pay structure. Now, there are freedoms in the framework. As I've already mentioned, there are choices of sub-factors that you choose to implement. And certainly in the journey we undertake with our clients, we have gone through great pains to make a kind of an industry agnostic, broad, holistic default framework. However, it's always important to adjust that and to refine that for the reality of that business. Because yes, we all need to be compliant. We all need to firstly avoid the risks of equal pay claims and retroactive compensation claims. But we also need to create pay structures which are going to be future-proof, which make sense, and which people trust in and believe in. The weighting of the sub-factors is another freedom within the framework, as is the number of categories. So is the salary band size, right? So I think the thing that I want to drive home here is that there are many ways in which the process itself should actually be really rigorous and quite linear, quite mechanistic, okay? And this is how you create objectivity and how you create something that is legally defensible but also accurate. However, there are freedoms within the framework because, of course, we understand that while we need to create sensible, gender-neutral pay structures that accurately appraise value and reward people according to the value that their role adds to the business, it also needs to be minimally disruptive. And so these need to be objective, in other words, non-arbitrary. There needs to be clear rationale behind things. And these also need to be documented to create that audit trail and built for gender neutrality in tool and in the way the process is carried out itself. Now, in closing, I just want to say that there are a few guiding principles which I would keep in mind when undergoing this journey. And as Michael said at the beginning, there is obviously risk in this entire process. This is an onerous directive. Let's not pretend otherwise. It is. But there's also opportunity. Transparency really can breed trust. It can breed perceptions of fairness. And when people believe that they are treated fairly and they believe that a process is fair, they first of all are much more likely to believe that the outcome is fair. And this creates a work environment and a culture where people feel like, listen, I'm motivated to give my best because I understand that there's no nepotism here, there's no victimization. It really is a matter of, within this fair and objective framework, my outputs are going to reflect my inputs, okay? So, as I've said, the tool and the process really need to be built for non-discrimination in mind, and especially when it comes to indirect discrimination, this is something that we might not always consider. And this is truthfully one of the stumbling blocks also of most traditional classification systems. They simply have not been built with this kind of thing in mind. And that in having a structured process, it obviously needs to be followed consistently and uniformly, okay? No fear, no favor, no exceptions. You go about this in quite a mechanistic way. And in fact, when we do this with our clients, what we actually stress is that evaluation committee members do not even immediately get to see what the final outcome of their evaluations are. Really, what's important for them to do is just to accurately appraise a job's value using these tools. That's all. Everything else comes later. Procedurally mitigating bias and inaccuracy is also something that I would definitely recommend you give consideration to. So, for example, something that we do with our clients is we have triggers that emerge when we see that different members of the evaluation committee are responding with a high level of variance. In other words, people have very different ideas of what the value of this role or this subfactor within this role actually is. And what does that tell us? That someone is either confused about the tool, about the job, about the process, or that bias is unintentionally creeping into this process. So this can be procedurally mitigated, right? And as I've already mentioned, auditability is very important. I think also this is a big change, and this is something that I would not underestimate. Communicating this in the right ways with the right people at the right time is important to actually start to build that trust in a key stakeholder group, such that there's less likelihood that people actually get anxious and even confused about this. So yes, in having a compliant pay structure, you have the confidence to know that if there are equal pay claims, you have a very high probability of responding favorably to those claims and defending your pay practices. But I think the way in which this is communicated, and this is also why it's important to train these key stakeholder groups, is in having champions of the process that, kind of in the day-to-day can advocate for it. You actually mitigate the temptation for people to even ask these questions and to fear that they might be discriminated against. And the last one, and this is something we could have an entire talk over, so I'm not going to elaborate on this too much, but HR practices need to be aligned with this, right? This is not occurring within a vacuum. Existing businesses with existing people, strategies, and practices already exist. And certainly things like incentive strategies, career progression plans, performance management systems, they need to be brought into alignment with this. And I think, again, this can be onerous, but it can also be a welcome invitation to actually enhance the machinery that we already have within our businesses, and to ultimately create that trust, create that fairness, and to create a performance culture that is good for everyone involved. And I'm probably over time already, but that's all I have to say on this for now. You're obviously welcome to reach out either through the chat now or subsequently if you have any additional questions, and I will throw back to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Yashar, for your very interesting presentation. Indeed, it was obviously, Yashar, both I gave you license to further when we had our discussions so that you could explore more the topic. So I'm not worried about the time because this is a very important topic, and obviously the insights that you had provided, both you and Dr. Patch, were of great value. So I would be opening the session for 10 minutes. I know that we are over time, but if anyone wants to put some questions, please feel free to do so. I think I have one already. It's by Rita Bird, which says the number of employees will be considered for a group of the number of employees will be considered for a group of companies or for each company within the group. I think this is more something that Dr. Patch will be able to address.
Yes, I can reply to this. So you need to look for reporting purposes. You need to look at the number of employees in each company, not per group, but it's per company.
Okay. So thank you very much. If there are any more questions.
If I can just add to that quickly while potential questions come in. Not talking about reporting requirements now, but the creation of pay structures themselves, they can exist at company level or at group level in the case of a group. And I think practically speaking, this largely depends on where HR sits. Do you have group HR? Are policies existing at a group level? In which case, it makes much more sense to create a pay structure that exists at a group level. But depending on the nature of the group and how the companies run themselves, this could also be done at a company level.
Okay. Is it a choice of the company? Ms. Swert asked again.
I'm not sure I understand the question. The choice,
I think
given what I've just said, yes. So look, if everything HR related is existing at a group level already, existing pay structures, incentive strategies and policies, performance management, then in fact it's most likely going to have to be done at a group level. Firstly, to be in compliance with that. But there is also a legal precedent of single source, which shows that there needs to be a single source of a pay structure when it comes to the.
okay. Thank you,
I've lost my
Yasha.
train of thought. Sorry.
Don't worry. We have another question which says this directive is between different genders, male and female, or even the same gender.
If I can reply to this, look, for reporting purposes, we need to look at different genders. And when it comes to access requests, it will be averages between male and female pay. So as such, the directive is based on gender pay gap. However, when it comes to claims, so if I, an employee, want to go to the tribunal on an unfair dismissal claim, it doesn't need to be a gender claim. Let me give you an example, Claudia. So I could say, Lara, my colleague Claudia and I do the same work or work of equal value, but we are paid differently. So it is, we are of the same sex, but I am making an equal pay claim. So when it comes to the claims before a Maltese court, there doesn't need to be, you don't have to need to have male or female. You can have two individuals of the same sex.
All right.
I hope this answers your question.
Yes. The one that put the questions about the group of companies highlighted that their area of concern is
Mhm.
that the business activities of the companies within the group will vary considerably.
Look, if you have a group of companies and the areas vary considerably, you may want to keep, things separate because there you can have different wage regulation orders which apply, so it may be complex. For reporting purposes, whether you hit the thresholds to report to the authorities, it will be taken as per company. So then you need to carry out, having established that for reporting, usually put reporting aside. Now, when it comes to create a salary structure, you need to think internally as, does it make sense to have one for the whole group or one for the various companies? So this is an HR decision, really and truly. But it's something, if the activities are considerably different, you may want to leave it per company.
I think practically speaking, also the question is who's going to administrate this? And this is where, if HR is existing at a group level, it often makes sense. What you could do, for example, is to define your criteria at a group level, but potentially alter the weightings at company level. But as I say, when there's a single source determining the pay structure, they essentially are responsible for administrating it. And when it comes to things like collective agreements, because there may be cases in which one company is bound by multiple collective agreements, the single source of that pay structure is who is held accountable. In other words, there's legal precedent from the EU that collective agreements cannot be a justifiable reason for roles being paid unequally. So yes, the directive recognizes unions and the right to collective bargaining, but ultimately the pay structures emerging from these collective agreements are going to need to be brought into alignment with the directive.
Another question, where the absolute majority of companies in Malta fall below the 50 employees and therefore no reporting is required, where does this leave employers with regards of setting up the structure and also employees, as there will be no way of having a comparative within the company?
No, employees below 50 or which have 50 employees are not required to report, but they're still required to have a salary structure in place. And the employees still can make equal pay claims. The only thing that employers below 50 may be exempt, and I say may because it depends how Malta will implement this, is to make available to employees the criteria of how they move to the next promotional level. That is the only exemption in the directive. So we need to move away from the idea that small employers will not have obligations. You still have to have a salary structure in place, and the salary structure needs to reflect value on the basis of the criteria outlined by Yash before, and employees would still be able to make an access request. So they can still come and ask you, listen, what is the average of female versus male employees in my category? And they can still make equal pay claims. So definitely you still have to have a salary structure in place.
I think the other question just to consider when it comes to smaller business as well, including bigger businesses, but when it comes to recruiting, you need to, prior to negotiation, as Laura has mentioned, you need to give the initial pay or its range for a role. And it's going to be impossible to do that if you don't already have a pay structure in place. So as businesses grow and as new roles are created, for example, the pay structure remains the backbone upon which these new roles or new vacancies are placed.
Well, thank you very much. I think this one was referring, if you could show again the details bound step 2 of the process, which slide was almost at the end of your presentation.
Sure. I believe it was this slide. So obviously I have not shared the details of what the sub-factors that we use in our model are, for example. But the idea here really is that a model or a tool is created which unpacks the 4 factors in more detail, and these need to be rated using a scale. In our case, it's a 1 to 5 scale. It doesn't need to be that way. And individual committee members would do this, again, on an individual basis. The reason I say this should be done on an individual basis is the moment you start off with conversation and discussion, group dynamics start to take over. You have dominant personalities, you have hierarchical dynamics that actually start to taint the process. And so we prefer that this is done independently, and that raw data is then aggregated thereafter to understand if there are inaccuracies. And I'll say something also, that when we did this internally in RSM, we, across our 80 to 100 roles, I can't remember precisely how many there were, we had 7 evaluators. We had 15 sub-factors in our scale. So in fact, we added 2 sub-factors to the default tool that we typically take to clients. And this resulted in something like 7,000 data points, okay? 7,000 individual ratings for each of these roles, for each of these sub-factors across all of these evaluators. And in only 4 or 5 cases did we actually need to stop and discuss them as a committee because there was a material disagreement. In other words, there was a range that was too big. And I think that is something that inspired a lot of trust internally in the evaluation committee members, that we're all on the same page. We've understood this. Even though we come from different parts of the business, we are giving adequate consideration and acknowledgement to the various roles within the business and the value that they add.
So we'll answer this, which will be the last question. In a 24/7 operational environment such as maritime transport, how can organizations implement pay transparency and objective job evaluation systems without undermining operational flexibility, particularly where allowances, overtime, and roster changes are frequent and sometimes unavoidable?
So, hi Warren, first of all. Look, the directive is not meant to limit flexibility in the sense that, and let me make sure I understood your question correctly, in the sense that if employees are working on social hours, or if they're working night shifts or on a shift pattern, and they want to, or employees are available to work overtime, you still can do it. But when there'll be, for example, when you see the averages, the fact that employees will work overtime and they will receive a higher pay, or the fact that there is an allowance because an employee can or should work shift allowances, that would justify the reason as to why some employees would be receiving a higher rate of pay than others. So it is still possible to have allowances for unsocial hours, for shift allowances, and employees to pay overtime. And they will justify, it will show, it would reflect, you would be able to justify why some employees would be receiving more pay than others.
If I can just add also, this is where having granularity of data becomes important. So Laura showed in her presentation pay reflected as an hourly rate. Okay. So in other words, there's some people that simply work more hours in a year than others. That is kind of standardized for. But even when it comes to overtime, the amount of overtime pay versus pay at the standard rate. So if you have that granularity of data, you can justify it.
You would be able to explain why some employees are receiving more than others, and it's justifiable if I receive an allowance because I'm working night shifts. Otherwise, how are you going to attract employees to work night shifts? As long then as all employees working night shifts and doing the same work are actually getting the allowance.
Okay.
To just respond to the last question here, I think it's fine that you may have, especially in micro-sized businesses, categories with one or perhaps two individuals within that category. You may even theoretically have a category that doesn't have any individuals in it. I would say that if you have, for example, a business with 7 people in it, it wouldn't make sense to divide your categories up into 25 categories, okay? What would be important is that there's uniformity in how that's done. So if your minimum job evaluation score, and this is the case for us with the RSM tool, is 200 and the max is 1,000, the size of those categories would need to be either uniform or mathematically correlated in some way. And what I mean by that is perhaps they get slightly bigger as you move up, or they get slightly smaller. This would need to be rationalized, but if it's kind of small bands, big band, small band, big band, that immediately reeks of being ad hoc and essentially a reverse engineering process. But if there is no comparator, I do not believe that that is a challenge. You still have a job evaluation exercise that is played out, with resulting in a pay structure that is classifying roles according to their value. You would just need to justify and rationalize why you have the amount of categories that you do and why you have the kinds of salary bands that you do.
Just on this point, just to make it very clear, employees don't have a right to ask you, listen, what is Lara earning? Or what is the average of category of another category? They have the right to know the averages and not individual salary, male versus female, of their category. Now, if the category is made of 2 individuals, myself, the person asking, and someone else, so you would easily know, you can easily, with 2 individuals in a category, identify what the other person is earning. The directive leaves there some room that you may give that information to the employee representative, a union, or the employee representative elected according to the regulations in place. And the employee representative then advises the employee whether they have a case or not. Now, in theory, it sounds like it would flow and that everything will remain confidential, but in practice, I think this is very difficult to retain confidentiality once the information is given to the employee rep. On the employee rep, it is very important that companies start looking at their organizations and determining whether they have an employee rep in place. Where the workforce is unionized, that is very easy because everything needs to be agreed with the union in place. Where it isn't, start looking at your organizations to start the process to elect the employee rep. Because in the directive, the role of the employee rep is extremely important. They can act on behalf of the employee at almost every point of the directive. So just to give you an example, if an employee does not want to make an access request directly, they can go through the employee rep. The job categorization itself, so the criteria as to how you categorize the workforce, needs to be agreed with the employee rep. So starting this process to having an employee rep is a very important first step from now until June.
Okay. Just one last question. All employers must have structures and transparency from 7 June, right? Even those with less than 50 employees.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we stop here. Thank you very much. As we come to the end of today's session, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Lara Pach and Mr. Yashar Klip, for their valuable insights. I would also like to thank, my thanks goes also to Michael Gallia, President of the Gozo Business Chamber, and to Bank of Valletta also for their support. I would also like to thank our team at the Chamber and our technical coordinator, Richard Gregg. Today's discussion highlighted that compliance with the Pay Transparency Directive is not only a legal obligation, but I also believe an opportunity for more transparency and a more and a more cohesive workforce as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next event. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.